So, okay, good morning to all. We are switching languages for our international students and for those who would like to follow us in English as well. But you can ask your questions in Turkish after Başak Hoca's presentation on climate-induced migration. So, okay, we're going to talk about climate-induced migration and who are these environmental migrants, and of course, what are the definitions, different definitions of environmental migrants. IOM, of course, defined environmental migrants, and according to this definition, they're environmental migrants or climate-induced migrants are persons who are obliged, who are forced to leave their habitual homes or choose to do so, either temporarily or permanently, and who move either within their country or abroad for reasons of sudden and or progressive change in the environment that, of course, adversely affects their lives or living conditions. Of course, this is a very broad definition, and we know when we look at statistics today, for example, like OCHA and other organizations, we see that most of the environmental migrants are living within their countries of inside. I mean, they're IDPs, internally displaced people, and they're not international migrants yet. But of course, like Afghans, you know, even Bangladeshi, some of them choose to leave the country to send remittances back home for adaptation, for mitigation, you know, in a way to increase their resilience in the community. So, you know, this can be permanent, this can be temporary. Sometimes they're also called, defined as environmental refugees, and maybe wrongly so. I mean, but there are no protection mechanisms as such, right? Targeting environmental migrants. We are now, you know, faced with, again, of course, we are living inside the pandemic, but we are further faced a kind of uncertainty, right? And these people, we don't know how to protect them. They don't know how to define themselves. What are the other mechanisms, etc. So these are big, big question marks today. And of course, when we look at projections, for example, by the UN, for example, the freshwater availability in Central, Southeast, and Southeast Asia is projected to decrease. And our world and our region is also affected by it. And of course, the Asia, different parts of Asia is totally affected. Different parts of Africa is affected. Coastal areas are affected, especially floods are another impact. So anyway, there's so many things to talk today, but without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Başak Yavcan, Associate Professor from Top University, who's hailing us actually from Brussels today, this morning. Thank you for accepting our invitation, Başak Hocam. The floor is yours, but before we give the floor to you, let us introduce you very briefly for those who may still not know you.
Thank you, Hocam. Welcome, everyone. Başak Yavcan is a senior researcher at the HUGO Observatory of Environment, Migration and Politics, University of Liège, and an associate professor of political science and international relations at Top University of Economics and Technology in Turkey, where she heads an interdisciplinary graduate program on migration studies. She holds a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh, Department of Political Science, has conducted research at Michigan University's Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, at New York University, and at the Northwestern University. Yavcan's research focuses on intergroup relations and public opinion, in particular regarding refugee integration, impact of immigration attitudes on Euroscepticism, immigrant acculturation attitudes, and the impact of media framing on the public opinion. Lately, she has been working on the integration of Syrian refugees in Turkey, with a particular focus on intergroup attitudes, institutional trust, Islamic radicalization, effectiveness of local and national policies, and interventions of promoting cohesion. We would like to thank you, Hocam, for your time, and I would like to give the floor to you.
Thank you for this introduction, for the generous introduction of myself, but also the great introduction provided by Şebnem Hocam to the topic. As a recent recruit in this area, what I try to bring into this discussion on environmental migration is based on more the causality, cause and effect relations, and looking more through the numbers. So I'll start with some numbers that you may have heard, because even though I study the numbers, I'm very critical when it comes to what we make out of them. So what you hear that there are some estimates, right, that in by 2050, 1 billion environmental migrants will there be. And this is a very big number, and really it scares everyone that, oh my God, so we should be careful about the environment because it induces migration and it will be invaded by environmentally induced migrants by 2050. In reality, we don't know. These are just estimates, and some of these estimates are what we call maximalist estimates, and some of them are minimalist estimates, and it's hard to know what exactly the numbers will be. And when we talk about environmental displacement, we call it displacement because a lot of this migration is actually internal, and we don't know whether or not it will be external by 2050. Another thing we don't know at the moment, is how the world will react to the climate change, and what kind of precautions, measures, adaptation measures they will be taking. So these are really kind of pessimistic estimates. They are great to bring the policymakers' attention to the issue, but they're not ideal for approaching the issue on a more rational level. So I think we should consider this also as a dimension. What we see in regards to these estimates also, another problem is approaching environmental migration as if it is something that is going to happen, as if it does not happen at the moment, whereas it does happen at the moment. As we speak, due to sea level rise, several islands in the Pacific are going under the water, and people in those places are experiencing this. Around the world, there are droughts because of the sudden temperature changes and volatility in the rainfall. And people are affected by that, and they have to migrate because of this. So all of this, putting this in perspective of this 2050, is a bit problematic. And also another thing is these approaching this as a horror scenario is kind of securitizing the issue, because in reality, migration is an adaptation of people to climate change. So they are actually adapting to climate change. And if we approach environmental migration as something like a horror scenario, we're basically taking that away from people and approaching them as if like they're doing something that they shouldn't be doing, when in fact they're just adapting to their new environment. So we also should care about climate change, even if it does not lead to migration, in other words. So like this kind of puts the migration into the climate change debate, sometimes inadvertently, a bit in a way to scare people off. And I think that is also a bit problematic. I wanted to ask you about the view. Did you maybe fix the view on yourself when you spoke? Can people see me as a speaker at the moment? Because I do not see myself.
Yes, Hocam, we can see you very clearly.
Okay, great. Perfect. I couldn't see myself, but maybe that's because of my connection. All right, perfect. What I would like to bring our attention to today is a bit of this causal mechanism that climate change or environment in general, the ecological processes lead to migration, and it's not easy. And that's why giving numbers out is also not easy. And something that even though we study with numbers, we always try to refrain from, because usually journalists want a number, you give them a number, and the number finds itself someplace else. But overall, we can say every year, 25 million people are displaced due to environment somehow, directly or indirectly. This is the estimate of United Nations, and this is way more than the number of people that are displaced due to, let's say, conflict around the world, right? So due to wars, due to internal conflicts in countries. So more people, a lot more people, several, I believe that number is about 8 million. So we're talking really 6 times more people being displaced due to environment. And this is very important, but it is very difficult to measure the impact of direct and indirect impact of climate change and environment on migration, because migration is really a multi-causal mechanism. When we do macro level studies around the world, looking at the different factors, different drivers of migration, several drivers come to our attention. The first one is, generally studied are the economic, socioeconomic factors. Then we have more political factors. Then we have demographic factors. And guess what? Climate change and environmental change affect them all. So they not only lead to migration directly, but also they change our surroundings and these different dynamics that also lead to migration. So the nexus between climate change and migration has been addressed since the early 90s by scholars of various disciplines, from economists, environmentalists, demographers, and political scientists. And it all started with a discussion of the more economic impact, but also when the decision to leave, an individual's decision to leave is considered, the efforts to pinpoint the exact causal path and impact of environmental drivers on migration have been challenged, because it could be through multiple channels and ways environment is impacting the habitability of our environment, of our living areas. On the one hand, the case studies on environment-induced migration had an easier time addressing these different factors in shaping migration decisions, but the problem was their conclusions were not generalizable. On the other hand, macro studies that have the advantage of external validity were challenged by data availability on migratory moves around the world, as well as the complexity of causal channels, because many of these variables have actually sometimes nonlinear and mostly indirect impact, or show an indirect impact of climate change on migration. So, but let's talk about the mechanisms and what we talk about when we say environmental change, right? We'll go into this direct and indirect paths, but when we say environmental changes, we mostly refer to 2 groups of changes in the environment. I think it's important to address them so that we can have an idea about how they may affect migration. The first one is sudden or rapid onset changes. And here, what we're talking about are really disasters, floods, storms, droughts, earthquakes, and man-made disasters. These rapid onset changes are very influential in explaining internal migration, internal displacement, because their effect is usually very sudden and temporary. And especially if the countries have the ability to deal with their consequences or to take precautions against them, towards them, and the impact could be minimized in terms of the migratory impact. But they hit everywhere, right, equally, but some areas more actually. For instance, Southeast Asia is more heavily affected by these disasters. Why? Because of geography simply, but also because we have more migration stemming from these disasters in Southeast Asia, because it's a very densely populated area of the world, in which, from the climate perspective, it shouldn't be, but it is. So at the end of the day, you have a lot of disasters happening there, and the impact is very visible. But most of this displacement really is within the country. People don't want to leave their country just because there was a disaster in where they live. Of course, that depends. If you're an island state, that changes the picture. But in general, usually disasters, floods, droughts, earthquakes impact the habitability of living areas, and they also lead to people to relocate mostly internally. And if they can go back, mostly they try to go back using there are many studies that look at this effect, and they show that these disasters also impact the economic well-being of the communities. And this is, again, we come to this indirect channel now of climate on migration. And also the recent study that I have published through my work for the University of Liège at the Hugo Observatory for the project MAGIC shows that actually the higher the impact of the disaster, the more economically impacted the people are in this area. And that actually, rather than increasing migration, it decreases migration. Why? Because you have some resources to migrate, and really a big disaster strips you away from those resources. So the big impact actually, big disaster actually results in less international migration for those people, because you need resources for international migration. And this is something that we come back to over and over, and we'll discuss more with regards to the impact of GDP. So when we come to slow onset changes, that's the second category. Those are mostly related to climate change. But mind you, disaster can also be related to climate change, or their effect could be exacerbated by climate change. When we talk about climate change overall, we talk about an increase in temperatures. But it's not just an increase in temperatures or decrease or in rains, but it's also a volatility. What do I mean by that? A variability. So all of a sudden, yes, you have an increase of hot days, but these hot days are out of the blue, like a hot heat wave coming in, or these droughts, the lack of rain coming out of the blue. So you not only have the reduction in the rain levels or increase in the temperatures, but you also have this increase in the variability, the changes within a year in the temperature. And that is horrible for crop yields around the world. And we may be sitting in a big city living with the products, produced, provided at every store for us, every supermarket for us, but for the 60%, even 70, I believe 65% of the world's population, their subsistence depends on agriculture. What that indicates is that any temperature, their subsistence depends on weather, and all these volatility in the weather really affects their livelihoods. So one variable that really exacerbates the impact of these slow onset changes, namely the temperature increases and the rainfall decrease volatility, is agricultural dependency. So if you live in a country, if you are someone who is dependent on agriculture more, that means that you are going to be affected more by these changes in your environment. Because droughts will affect you more. And add to that, if you as a humankind manage your environment badly, that will indicate that if you cut more trees, you will increase that rainfall volatility. You'll increase the magnitude of impact that you are prone to as a result of this. So usually the agricultural link is very important to explore when we talk about the slow onset changes. Some of these changes also relate to overall sea level rises, and this is really an unfair process because the countries that are subject, again, mostly in the Asia Pacific region, the countries that are subjected to this sea level rise, that suffer the consequences of sea level rise, are not the ones responsible for sea level rise, are not the ones responsible for climate change, but they suffer the consequences. What happens is you have many islands now going slowly underwater, and this is happening as we speak. It's not a goal. This is not something that we should target 2050 because there will be 1 billion supposedly environmental migrants. No, this is happening right now. And many islands that, you know, we see as fun touristic destinations like Maldives is actually dealing with this threat, and it affects the livelihoods of the people. There are relocations of people from some islands to the others. There's discussion of whether or not they should buy new islands, more high-laying islands. But really the problem is that these low-lying islands are heavily affected and they have no place to go. They don't have any mountains to go. Their territory is really limited and dispersed, as a matter of the fact. So that's the second level that temperature changes have an impact on habitability. But the real third and important indirect impact is through income. As the temperature changes, the climate change in general affects our income in various ways. And income, let's talk about a bit of the relationship between income and migration. Scholars for years believed that if you become a rich country, if your income as a country increases, you don't migrate anymore. Well, recently we found out that's not true. The effect between income and migration is something called a reversed U-shaped curve. What do I mean by that is if you are very poor and very rich, out-migration from your country is indeed low. But if you're actually in that mid-range category, middle income family and country, excuse me, well, also a family, that's when you migrate because you have access to resources. Most probably you are more educated, so you have more access to information as to how to migrate. So any impact to this, to where you are on this curve, is also to impact your migration. So let's say you are in a mid-income, mid-high income individual in a country, and your income is decreased due to climate change because of agriculture, because of some other reason, because you spend more on healthcare now, because you, let's say a lot of people, our colleague Caroline does work on fishermen, and a lot of them are not aware, but they move a lot because fish move a lot, and fish move mainly because of climate change. So they are directly affected through this income. So, but in a lot of places, the lands are not habitable anymore and people need to move. So they move mostly internally, but if they have the resources, they move internationally because their lands are not habitable anymore. If you ask them, that's when it becomes very tricky to pinpoint the climate effects on migration, because when you ask these people, why did you move? They don't say it's because of climate. They say because we don't have the same crop yields anymore, because I couldn't do fishing anymore, because, where I live is now, there's a study on Khuzestan region of Iran. The air was too polluted and we had several health issues, so we moved. But why? It's because, your income is affected because of the climate. So they say they moved because of economic reasons, when in reality, it's a climate that triggered these economic conditions. That's precisely why the term environmental refugee, climate refugee, is problematic, because we don't know, and people themselves, they don't know why they moved. And so having these very clear-cut categories is problematic, because someone you consider as economic migrant, as if something bad, is actually a climate-induced migrant at the end of the day. So this is also something we discover when we study the indirect impacts of slow onset changes on migration that we see a lot. So, but on the other hand, again, climate change may increase your migration if you are a middle income country, or if you're a middle income individual where you have the resources. But if you're low income, the picture changes, because it really makes you less able to migrate because you lose so much income. And you don't have this, I mean, even migration, when you think about it, is a luxury. We should not think of migration as, oh, it's the really poor people who are migrating because they don't have any subsistence. No, people actually stay. There are a lot of immobile people that are left behind because they don't have the resources to cope with climate change. And what happens is, hopefully someone from their family maybe moves, or sends them money, but they continue to suffer the consequences of this climate change. So another factor that we see an indirect impact of climate is exactly because of this mechanism of internal migration, is urbanization. Again, a less studied area, but we see this indirect link that climate first leads to an unplanned, unmanaged urbanization because of internal migration to the cities, because their rural areas are not habitable. The income people generate is not enough for their subsistence anymore, or their lands become simply dry lands. There's land degradation. Maybe they have limited water availability, and they move to cities in a very unplanned way, which creates heavy pressures on the cities. And then when they don't, let's say, reach to what they hoped for in these cities, then they migrate internationally. So this kind of unmanaged urbanization, unplanned urbanization, increasing the pressures on urban centers, also environmentally at many times, has an effect on migration. Finally, last but not least, it's also very important, is the link between the climate change and conflicts. Lately, researchers have started to study this more and more. And the argument here is actually also linked to resources, also linked to income and income generating factors. But the main idea is that with the climate change, it becomes your habitability is affected. The resources with all the droughts are reduced, and the prices go up, and you have more competition for resources. And this competition, the mechanism can be different, of course, may not be exactly like this, but overall the idea is that this competition for ever more scarce resources that is triggered by climate change induces conflict. And that conflict in turn makes you migrate. There are studies conducted. There's a big debate on Syria on this, whether or not the Syrian conflict is a result of this, for instance. And they basically argue that the mismanaged policies of Assad in terms of water extraction for agriculture together, so it's kind of this man-made process, together with the droughts that have been affecting a certain area, inflicted more conflict, and people migrated out of these areas. And it's actually the people who migrated out of these areas to areas like Dara created the conflict in the first place, triggered the conflict in the first place, which then spread the world. There is a big debate on this, whether or not this is exactly the case, precisely because it's so hard to prove that it's the environment that's behind this. But nevertheless, we can really say that the issue of environment is understudied. And when we had at the beginning of last year in February, when the border between Greece and Turkey was opened and thousands of people were at the border, many of them were Afghani migrants. And we do hear about them a lot because a lot of the deportations taking place out of Turkey where also, I'll get to this, but our Afghanis and the migration BGMM people talk about this as such. We sent them back, and 2 months later, we see the same people coming back to Turkey. Why? If you ask them, it's because of subsistence. But why? Because they had a huge drought in 2016, which really has affected their livelihoods, and more people also continued until 2018 and migrated out of Afghanistan because it's not habitable anymore. And I am sure that also increased the conflict in the country, that exacerbated the impact of the conflict in the country as well. So as you can see, when we consider the impact of climate on migration, we need to think of all the different channels it is impacting migration. There is a direct impact, yes, by affecting the habitability of our milieu, but there is also various channels. There are various channels of indirect impact through agricultural dependency, through GDP or income of a country, through wages, through urbanization, and through conflicts that need to be considered. And actually, in our statistical analyses across the world, that's where we find most of the support for, not really the direct impact of environment, but also mostly this indirect impact of environment through GDP and urbanization. And this means that when we study, so let's say we read a study that says, oh, wage differentials, income affects migration this much, we should keep in mind that some of that effect is environmentally induced. We should not forget this. And this will, and when we address the issues related to income, we should also keep that in mind. And a lot of times, European Union, for instance, has been investing in very low income countries to increase their income so that there is less migration, where in fact, if you make people more middle income, that'll give them more resources to migrate. It's not as straightforward. It's only when they become really rich, when their countries become really habitable in terms of environment, in terms of politically, socially, economically, it's only then people have less intentions to migrate, not, at this low to middle income level. But on the other hand, studies also show that income inequalities have an effect on migration as well. And climate can also impact income inequalities in a country, something else that we should consider. So more fair distribution of income is something less migration inducing. But at the end of the day, the world is being impacted by climate change. Climate change impacts disasters and your vulnerability to disasters. So both slow onset and rapid onset changes are affected by climate. And some countries, they have the ability to build walls. They have the ability to increase their resilience to climate change. Those are mostly developed countries. They can do relocation in a very planned, nice way. And there are other countries who do not have these resources. So you have then people in Kiribati actually training their people, teaching them English, giving them some skills so that they can survive when they migrate. And this is also management of migration and adaptation. So the world should be ready that there will be more migration because of climate rather than, closing its door and closing its eyes. And yes, if these countries have more income, better resilience mechanisms, only then we can talk about less migration. But currently, migration is their only coping strategy in dealing with climate change. And I think I will leave it at that, and maybe we'll have questions, and this way we can bring in more examples from around the world as to how this effect takes place, if that's okay with everyone.
And thank you, Başak Hocam. Thank you. So you started with the two different reasons actually on climate change or climate-induced migration. One is, of course, slow onset changes. The other is rapid changes. And of course, there's since we live in the anthropogenic period, right? Man-made disasters. That's also important. You also talk about the income level, or so-called income inequalities, how this also has an impact on climate migration or environmental migration. Like as we see also in the migration theory, is not the poor, right, or nor the rich actually is on the go, but the mid-level category, people with resources, people with some capital, whether economic, social, or human capital. So also another very important point that you mentioned is that people cannot really pinpoint those, even climate migrants. They cannot really pinpoint the exact reason of migration, their migration, right? They usually link it with some losing of livelihoods, conflicts, etc., etc. But usually there is this indirect link there with the climate effect. And you also mentioned about the urbanization and of course, with rapid urbanization and then internal migration, which may actually lead to international migration, which I would like to underline here again. Most of the climate-induced migrants are in fact IDPs, internal displaced people, not the international migrants. So there is no reason to scare all the populist parties actually all around the world today, and to take up more draconian measures. And climate change and conflict. You mentioned the link between climate change and conflict, and what other, what better case study than Syria, since Turkey is also affected by it. Of course, again, there are different discussions whether this conflict in Syria is linked with climate change to a certain extent, but there are other studies who disagree. And of course, you bring out the Afghan case. This is interesting. Of course, not only Taliban, other ethnic problems, other gender-related problems, but it's also the droughts, the water scarcity, everything is affecting their livelihoods and also triggering internal displacement within Afghanistan as well. And but as you said, migration is a coping strategy. Right? People should know and how to manage this, how to live with it, and it's to build resilience actually. So it's a very important factor, nothing to be scared of, to be honest. But of course, one question comes to mind. We don't even know how to manage migration at this point. Right? And there are so many problems like Global Compact, European Union new pact on migration and asylum, for example, which is not taking the human security, for example, into consideration. There are many other problems. I mean, as you mentioned Mexico, you mentioned Southeast Asia, of course, you mentioned South Asia and West Asia, Turkey. We don't know how to manage migration. So what do we expect if there is more migration? How can the international community manage these migration flows?
That's a big question. Shall I answer? Shall I give it a shot?
I'm an IPCC member, you can say. So I'll leave it to IPCC or UN.
Yeah.
So that's a big question. I don't know if it's a rhetorical question. It's very difficult to answer at this point. But, maybe another question is, how do you think Turkey will be affected by this?
I think Turkey will be, being at a crossroads, really, as a transit country. Turkey is already being affected by this. If the theories about Syria are even like 10% true, we have been affected, and which is usually the case with climate migration. You're never like fully, it's never because of climate only. It's always like partly because of climate, partly because of other things. And same with Afghanis. I think currently we are being affected by this, and there could be this effect maybe increasing if there are more droughts around us, and Middle East is definitely an important destination that is to be impacted by this climate change, by the increasing temperatures. And we could also have, in our country, we could have more dry lands, especially the southeastern region is already again being impacted by this. So this is why I emphasize water resources development capacity over and over, because if you have the capacity, if you have the infrastructure, you can offer alternatives to your farmers. You can build better watering systems. You can manage the wells, manage the longevity of the wells, plan where they are planted and where they are not to be planted, how to make best of underwater, land waters, etc. But that takes really good planning. And if you leave it up to the nature, because we didn't leave it up to the nature so far, because we ruined it so far, it's not, we cannot really manage it well. So it really needs to be well planned. And we already see this effect in our studies in the southeastern region, and not only there. I mean, even in the western parts of the country, products that we could not have, we have a yield on them because the weather is warmer, and we are being affected by this. And you have but we're exasperating the impacts. The more we pollute, the more trees we cut, because all this variability that I mentioned, if you cut the trees, you are increasing the rainfall variability, and you are increasing you're more susceptible to this variability in the rainfall if you don't have trees. So all of this is, it's a big ecosystem, and the more we intervene in it in a destructive way, the more we're affected by climate change, even though we may not be fully responsible ones for creating its effect. And I think that's another thing. Those who are mainly responsible should chip in more into the global efforts in managing climate change, and especially the immediate effects that we are currently seeing in these island states, I believe.
Yeah, especially developed states, right? The global north, the US, for example, number one, and of course, other countries also, they have to really put more efforts into this and perhaps more money into this to deal with the adverse effects. And also, one big problem is probably we're talking about perhaps a voluntary return of Syrians, voluntary return of Afghan populations, for example. This also makes this climate impact. I mean, the impact on climate and climate change will make it also more difficult for people to take up this option, right? Voluntary return option.
Because their initial lands are not habitable anymore. And it's also, again, when climate triggers conflict, then you have, their farms are now landmines, they cannot really use them for subsistence, or their lands are taken. So all of this is a vicious cycle that makes the return very difficult. And that's why I think that I find this quite missing in the discussions on sustainability of return. We only talk about return, but you return people, they come back, unless you ensure the sustainability of that return. And that's only possible when you ensure their livelihoods of these people, their security, physical security, their social integration, because they may be stigmatized. Assad and the many in the Syrian society see the Syrian refugees in Turkey as the enemy of the state, So now you're talking about sending these people back, or what are they going to be subject to?
Yes, definitely. That's the Syria example, and we see the same thing actually in Iraq as well. Because most of the time when certain groups of people live a region, then there is a demographic change too, right? So when they come back, they don't see the same city or same town or same village anymore. And so then another inner conflict will start. Yes, so we can take questions, as I said, either in Turkish or English. Türkçe'de sorabiliriz sorularımızı. Dolayısıyla ben hocamız Aykut hocayı görüyorum burada. Hocam nasılsınız? Hoş geldiniz. Hoş geldiniz. Batuhan, siz de hoş geldiniz. Sorumuz varsa Türkçe ve İngilizce yöneltebiliriz. Batuhan, okay. Batuhan elini kaldırdı. Buyurun Batuhan, sözü kısaca kendinizi tanıtır mısınız lütfen?
Evet, Batuhan Güneş ben. Siyaset Bilimi Uluslararası 3. sınıf öğrencisiyim TOB Üniversitesi'nden. Hocam çok teşekkür ederiz konuşmanız için. Ben şöyle bir şey merak ettim hocam. Şimdi göçün sebeplerinden bahsediyorum. Biraz da deneyimsiz olduğum için bağışlayın. Göçün sebepleri üzerine konuştuk ama şey diyebilir miyiz acaba? Beyin göçü ve daha nitelikli göçler haricinde hemen hemen her göçün bir alt sebebi vardır ve bu sebeplerden biri de bu çevre merkezli, iklim merkezli göçtür diyebilir miyiz? Böyle bir genelleme yapma imkanımız olabilir mi acaba? Bunu merak etmiştim ben ama teşekkür ederim hocam.
Teşekkür ederim bu güzel soru için. İşte aslında tam da bu kompleks mekanizmaya işaret ediyorsun. Hiç belli olmaz. Çok nitelikli göç de aynı şekilde iklim merkezli olabilir. Çünkü bir iklimsel distress yaşadığında bir bölge, bir baskı yaşadığında ilk göç edenler hep daha eğitimli olanlar. Çünkü olabilecekleri tahmin ediyorlar ve imkanları var, başka bir yerde iş bulma imkanları var, bilgi sahibiler nereye gidebilecekleri konusunda ve biraz da gelir sahibiler bu seyahati planlayabilmek konusunda. Mesela şeye bile baktığımızda 2015 yılında Türkiye üzerinden Avrupa'ya geçen Suriyelilere bile baktığımızda inanılmaz yüksek oranda örneğin lise, üniversite mezunları olduğunu aralarında gördük. Birleşmiş Milletler'in Yunan adalarında yaptığı çalışmalarda veyahut da çocuklarının çok okumasını istedikleri için Avrupa'ya gitmek istediklerini gördük. Yani her nitelikli göç yani şöyle düşünelim, her zaman daha yüksek gelirli kişiler ilk bir çatışma olduğunda da ne diyelim gemiyi ilk terk edenlerden oluyor. Çünkü imkanları var. Çünkü daha temkinli olabiliyorlar. Risk almalarına ihtiyaç olmayabiliyor. Yani niçin risk alalım? Zaten gelirimiz var. Orada da bir ev alıverelim dursun. Orada da bir işte iş yapalım ne olur ne olmaz diyebiliyorlar. O yüzden aslında en çok düşünmemiz gerekenler burada geride kalanlar, belki de en başta konuştuğumuz Şebnem Hoca'yla konu, bir sürü insanda iklimsel koşullardan etkileniyor, gelirleri düşüyor, yaşamsal alanları, havaları kirleniyor, sağlıkları bozuluyor. Ama imkanları ve yetenekleri, skillleri olmadığı için göç edemiyorlar ve onlara yönelik çalışmalar son derece az, son derece kısıtlı. Belki onları daha çok düşünmeliyiz. Senin sorunu da buraya taşıyabiliriz belki.
Çok teşekkür ederim hocam değerli yorumlarınız için.
Ben teşekkür ederim güzel sorun için. Thank you, Dua, for your comments. You can follow our webpage of Hugo Observatory. We conduct several projects around the world with regards to these impact of climate on migration. I'm sure you'll find them interesting. I can share it here maybe.
Yeah, thank you hocam. Evet, iyi olur. Okay, başka sorusu olan? Bu arada.
Şuraya hemen koyuyorum.
Asilay hoş geldin. Sorun var mı?
Hoş bulduk hocam. Biraz geç kaldım. Dersten sonra zor yetiştim.
Evet, olsun. Bu programı sonradan YouTube'dan da paylaşıyoruz. Asbigom'un web sitesinden. Oradan da daha sonra izleyemediğiniz kısımları izleyebilirsiniz elbette.
Tamam, teşekkür ederim.
Hocam Zehra'nın bir sorusu var galiba. Zehra Tekin elini kaldırmış.
Buyurun.
Merhaba Zehra, ben ASTÜ'de yüksek lisans öğrencisiyim Assoc çalışmalarında. Aynı zamanda Güç Dersi'nde de çalışıyorum. Benim sorum şu yönde, yani bildiği üzere şu anda halihazırda uluslararası hukukta iklim göçmenlerine ilişkin herhangi bir çalışmanın hem çalışma kısıtlı hem de herhangi bir tanımlama yok. Ve son zamanlarda bu kadar gündemdeyken sizin yaptığınız çalışmalar veya düşünceleriniz herhangi bir adım atılabilir mi uluslararası hukukta iklim göçmenlerine ilişkin?
Yani aslında iklim göçmenlerine yönelik iklim göçmenliği oluştuğunda ya da çevre ile ilişkili göçmenlik oluştuğunda buna karşı hukuki bir karşılığı var pek çok ülkede. Mesela Amerika Birleşik Devletleri'nde bir deprem olup da insanlar Dominik'ten geldiklerinde, Haiti'den geldiklerinde temporary protection statüsü veriyor aslında. Türkiye'dekine benzer bir statü veriyor, geçici bir statü veriyor. Bu tabii ulusal mevzuatta karşılığı olan bir şey ve iktidardaki başkan Obama iken iyi, Trump'a geçince sıkıntı yaşayabiliyor bu statü ve bu statüdekiler. Bu da senin de belirtmiş olduğun gibi uluslararası bir tam anlamıyla karşılığı olmadığı için burada bir tartışma var aslında. Yani bu forced environmentally induced forced displacement'da acaba şeyin içine girsin mi? Should this also be considered grounds for refugee status? And the current refugee regime does not allow for that. The fear of many people is if you put this in the refugee, it will be really watered down and people are already resistant to taking in refugees. They will not take in they will even take even less. So that's the real big concern about this. So by trying to give them more protection, you may actually giving an overall population, a bigger population, less protection as a matter of the fact. But on the other hand, it is a forced displacement. Then by approaching it like it is economically induced, you are watering down the forced nature of it. So it's really a double-edged sword. The ideal would be to really focus on, in my opinion, an alternative international status for these people. But again, as I described, how do you really pinpoint if their displacement is really environmentally induced or not? When you come to the bottom of it, a lot of displacement is environmentally induced. And with disasters, I'll give it to you. It's more straightforward. There happened a disaster. My land is not there anymore. There was a flood. There was something. So I had to migrate. Sure, that's fine. But with other things, especially with slow induced changes in our slow onset changes in our environment, it's really difficult to pinpoint to the exact effect and whether or not you're really environmentally forcibly displaced. So I think that's where the real conflict comes in, and I am more in favor of managing all kinds of migration and not approaching economic migrants as if they are a big horror. You know, yeah, people move because they need to, and nothing is more natural than that. So sometimes this is induced by droughts, sometimes it's induced by wage differentials. And why is it so bad? You know, we should really manage this rather than being afraid of it. I think governance is really the key here, and governing without fear is the key here. Unfortunately, it pays off more to induce the fear among your electorates and guarantees you better re-election. But we really, if we're not far-sighted in this issue, we'll be suffering the consequences big time, and no one can shut their doors to anyone anymore. There will come to a point. So I think really good management of all kinds of migration is also the key to better management of environmentally induced migration, because environment can induce all kinds of displacement. So that's my take on this.
Evet, çok doğru. Göçün her anlamında, hani tek bir nedeni yok belirttiğiniz gibi. Her anlamda daha iyi yönetişim çok daha önemli, öne çıkıyor gerçekten. Ama yani tabii eşitsizlikler de var, değil mi? Yani o kadar çok eşitsizlik var ki eşitsizlikler de sürekli artıyor. İster gelir seviyesindeki eşitsizlikler olsun, ister işte dedik ya küçük ada devletlerin aslında bunda hiçbir suçu yok ama sonuçta sonucu direkt sonucu hatta onlar çekiyor. Neticeyi onlar görüyor maalesef, olumsuz neticeyi. Yani bu eşitsizliklerin giderek büyümesi aslında dünyadaki sorun. Bir başka sorun da yine bununla bağlantılı olarak eşitsizliklerle, yani bu ekonomik eşitsizlik, sosyal adaletsizlik, yani hepsinin bir bütünü eşitsizlik dediğimizde bir başka sorun da aslında bütün bu eşitsizliği çözmede, değil mi, küresel kuzeye bakmamız, yani onlardan bir medet ummamız ya da onların bunu zaten çözeceğine olan inancımız, belki 60'lardan 70'lerden gelen bir bakış açısıyla biraz da bunu da belki değiştirmemiz gerekiyor dünyada. Yani neden şimdi mesela South, yani Güney işbirliği diye bir şey var, değil mi? İnsan yardım anlamında da. Yani hem Güney, Kuzey, yani bunları bir arada yapabileceğimizi anladığımız an, yani az gelişmiş bir ülkeyle daha fazla gelişmiş bir ülke arasında da aynı şekilde, eşit şekilde dağılımı yapabildiğimiz anlamda zaten yapabilsek zaten bunlardan belki bu kadar bahsetmeyeceğiz.
Hocam belirttiğiniz nokta çok önemli. Aynı şekilde kalkınmada da kuzeye bakıyor olmamız çevresel etkilere bizim daha açık ve kırılgan hale gelmemize de sebep oluyor çoğunlukla. Örneğin işte bu belli tip kalkınma modelleri işte beraberinde ne hadi uzalım işte madencilik yapalım, ama madencilik yaparken oradaki toprağı zehirliyorsun, oradaki tarımsal faaliyetleri uzun vadede sıkıntıya sokuyorsun, ağaçları kesiyorsun vesaire. Oradan gelecek fayda birken uzun vadede yarattığın zarar 100 oluyor. Neden? Çünkü işte Fransa'da da madenler varmış zamanında. Maden iyidir, güzel, işte altın şudur falan ama
Belçika'da hocam, Belçika'da ama kapattılar hepsini. Çünkü neden? Getirisi götürüsünden daha az. Yani onun yerine işte başka ülkelerden almayı, eğer alacaklarsa, ya da başka bir enerjiyle onun üzerine, yani onu halletmeyi daha uygun buldular. Hani ama Güney ülkeleri bunu henüz yapamıyor ya da yaptırılmıyor. Yani bir şekilde bu eşitsizliklerin devamında da tabii bu işte neoliberal düzenin, neokolonyal düzenin de bir etkisi var illaki.
Kesinlikle. Biraz öyle öğrenmiş olmamız da öğrendiğimiz pratiği uygulamamıza sebep oluyor sorgulamadan. Bu da ama yani biz daha kırılgan olduğumuz için coğrafi olarak bizi zor duruma sokacak olan bir şey aslında. Evet, sizin de daha önceki toplantılarda da edindiğiniz bilgiler doğrultusunda belki de deniz kenarında değil dağlarda, tepelerde bir yerler almak daha mantıklı emeklilik için.
Okey, bakın yine kısa vade düşündük. Ama ne yapalım yani, insanoğluyuz. Evet, Maldivler çok güzel bir örnek gerçekten. Çünkü orada Maldivler bir de ada değil aslında. Aslında Coral Reef, yani mercan adaları diye geçiyor. Hani gerçek bir ada bile değil. Dolayısıyla hani onların, mercanların yaşaması lazım ki adalar zaten üstte kalsın. Ama mercanlar ölüyor. Dolayısıyla adalar da aşağı doğru çekiliyor, ya da bir kısmı en azından. Zaten hani Maldivler'de gerçek yerel halkın yaşadığı çok az ada var.
Çok ada var, evet.
Evet, diğerleri hani turistik ve tamamen aslında çevreyi de kirleten adalar bunlar. Hani
ve gelirini turizmden yani yegane kaynağı, en temel kaynağı turizm olan bir ülke için.
Evet.
Tabii ki herhangi bir çevredeki kirlenme, işte mercanların zarar görmesi, renklerinin açılması, değişmesi, ölmesi, bunlar çok ciddi sonuçları olan şeyler.
Öyle gerçekten. Başka sorumuz var mı? Başka sorumuz yoksa hocamızı artık gönderebiliriz. Sizi ne zaman Türkiye'de döneceğiz? Yani ne zaman Belçika ile ilişkiniz kesilecek mi?
Bakalım hocam, normal koşullarda 2 yıllıktı şey yaptığım proje. Tabii bu pandemiden ötürü bir takım uzatmalar oldu. Göreceğiz nasıl sonuçlanacağını. Ben burayla ortaklaşa çalışmaya hep devam edeceğimi düşünüyorum. Şekli nasıl olur bilmiyorum ama en kısa, ilk kısa vadede yazın oradayım. Önümüzdeki yılda dönmüş olacağım diye planlıyorum.
İyi, tamam, sizi burada da görmek isteriz. Çok teşekkür ediyorum. Ağzınıza sağlık
Ben
gerçekten.
teşekkür ederim hocam. Nazik davetiniz için.
Devamını diliyoruz bu alanda. Tekrar size teşekkür ediyoruz. Bütün katılımcılarımıza da teşekkür ediyoruz. Dediğim gibi YouTube üzerinden de yayınlayacağız. Hani duyurularımızı da yapacağız Başak Hocam. Tekrar teşekkürler. Bir sonraki webinarımızda ilgilenen arkadaşlar için yine diaspora politikaları konusuna, diasporaya geri döneceğiz. Bir ara vermiştik kısa. Diaspora politikaları ve Batı Avrupa'daki Türk diasporası üzerine olacak. 9 Haziran'da YTB ile birlikte. Teşekkür ediyorum. Hoşça kalın. Herkese iyi günler diliyorum.
Teşekkürler, iyi günler.